Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to welcome our newest member of the committee as well, Mr. Kerry from Ohio. It's great that our committee is at full representation. Hopefully, the Democrat Party will not remove any more from our committee, and we get to keep this same membership moving forward. But I'd also like to welcome our witnesses today, which includes one of our former colleagues, and a former member of this committee, Director Mulvaney, who coincidentally was sworn in as head of the White House Office of Management and Budget almost exactly 5 years ago today. At the time, that was the latest ever that an OMB director assumed the job in a new administration, a little less than 1 month after a new president was sworn in. But under the Biden administration, we are now a year longer than that without an OMB director. There's a lot to unpack today, but before I start, I have to address the CBO score, the CBO letter that you submitted into the record. I'm glad that you did, because in fact, that record shows and proves, according to the Congressional Budget Office, that inflation is outpacing wage growth. And when you talk to any American, they won't buy what you're selling. They know that they can't purchase as many as goods today as what they could a year ago, and it's because of inflation. And whenever you try to say that increases in prices are only temporary, they're not buying it either. And you know what? The economists aren't either. 7.5% year to year, the highest inflation in 40 years. Give me a break. But I'm glad you put that in the record, because in fact, that CBO score showed that inflation in rural areas is 130% more than in urban areas. So thanks for putting that into the record, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot to unpack today, but I will start by saying that it seems budget Democrats are working at cross purposes. Last year, we had a hearing about Congress's power of the purse and how to reassert our constitutional role in budgeting and spending so that it wasn't being usurped by executive branch decision-making. What we learned was that if Congress did its job, budgeting, appropriating, and authorizing programs on a timely basis, it would go a long way to removing the ability of unelected bureaucrats to make decisions about government spending while also restoring some fiscal sanity to Washington. And yet, today we're talking about passing off Congress's responsibility for the debt to unelected career government employees. This would severely undermine, if not destroy, the power of the purse my colleagues claim they believed in less than a year ago. It would allow Congress to take credit for spending without being accountable for the debt it creates. Which brings us back to today's hearing. The real reason we're here is because Democrats want to get rid of any obstacles standing in the way of their radical agenda. An agenda that has unleashed a multitude of crises, the highest spike in prices in 40 years, a national debt above 30 trillion, and that's with the T, businesses facing chronic worker shortages and a supply chain crisis. For the last 12 months, Mr. Chairman, Democrats have been focused on their partisan agenda while the check engine light of the Biden economy has been on and flashing bright. Inflation rose faster in Joe Biden's first year in office than President Trump's entire first term. Democrats first denied inflation existed. You denied today and said that it's only temporary in some cases, and then dismissed it as transitory. Even members of this committee, like you, Mr. Chairman, said panicking over inflation was uninformed and misguided. Economists warned for months of the impact that reckless government spending would have on inflation. What did Democrats do? They spent $2 trillion in the president's bailout bill, a bill they claimed was meant for COVID, but less than 9% went to combating the virus. The crisis has been especially painful for Americans living in rural communities. Recently, the CBO found inflation, what you just submitted to the record, in rural areas was 130% that of urban areas, and they experienced 25% slower real wage growth than urban areas. Now Democrats are claiming a $5 trillion spending bill will fix inflation, even though it was written while Democrats were either denying inflation or calling it transitory. And even though the CBO has confirmed it it would add $3 trillion to the debt. If we combine the $68 trillion in spending Democrats called for in their fiscal year 22 budget with what they have passed since Nancy Pelosi became Speaker in 2019, it'd be more than all taxes paid by every American in U.S. history. For the last 40 years, the debt limit has typically been one of the only times that Congress has had a serious conversation about the national debt. Debt limit negotiations has given us real checks on government spending, including statutory limits on discretionary spending like those in the Budget Control Act of 2011. If the debt limit didn't exist or was raised to a gazillion dollars, as the chairman has suggested in the past, Washington Democrats would spend without end. Democrats claim the government can print as much money as it wants to spend.
You could wrap up, please. Your time's expired. I'm giving you much more time, but you can wrap up, please.
All right. Well, Mr. Chairman, we've seen what happens when Congress tries to exempt itself and the basic laws of economics. We should not allow Congress to exempt itself from our budget laws and hand over more responsibility to elected bureaucrats.